In my role in Aurecon as Technical Director, I get involved in a lot of projects, wide and varied, and height datum's a very important aspect of those projects, and it's why I'm here to contribute to this series of talks, because it's a topic that I feel very passionate about. When I'm discussing any of these things, what I'm going to do, I'm going to break it down into three main ideas and concepts. The first one is actually going back to fundamental basics, and I realise for some people this may be known information, for others it may not be, but it is very important, and I do find myself coming back to the fundamentals in a lot of conversations, whether it's with surveyors or stakeholders of information, because it's very important to understand some of these concepts. So I'm going to start with a diagram that some of you may be familiar with. Okay, so the reason I go back to this diagram very often is because it's important to understand these fundamentals when talking about heights and height datum. Topography is the land, and more often not the land that we're measuring. The geoid is an equal potential gravitational surface, which is a big way of describing more or less a shape that sea level would form if it covered the Earth. Picture Kevin Costner in Waterworld, where there's no land and the water, free from any other contributing factors, is allowed to form a shape. The ellipsoid is a theoretical mathematical approximation of the Earth. We'll come to that shortly. In the old days, this wasn't so relevant. It was really only used to define 2D map projections. And all the surveying techniques in the past were all gravitational based, so we didn't really need to worry about this diagram too much. When it really became important is when the invention of GPS, they're my satellites, GPS came about as a way of positioning yourself on the Earth. Now, all of a sudden this ellipsoid became far more important because as it was a global positioning system, it needed a global reference frame to define, not just in 2D position, but height. That's fine, but what was not well known and what GPS couldn't do was define gravity or the geoid that well. So this figure, what we call the geoid separation, or more importantly the model that models the difference between the geoid and the ellipsoid became more important. A lot of time and effort, as you'll hear from my colleagues at LINS, has gone into measuring gravity and getting a very good model of this geoid across our country to centimetre level, and that should be celebrated. What we do need to understand though, that there are two main ingredients that come into defining an accurate datum. One is the geoid, and the second is how we actually physically define that datum. So we have two things. We have NZ geoid 2016 and we have NZ datum 2016. So the key point I'm going to make here is the difference between geoids and datums, and more specifically NZ geoid 16 and New Zealand datum 2016. And the reason this is important is because a lot of people come to me and say, yes, but I'm using geoid 16, so they think they're working on the datum, when they're not. The fundamental difference between a geoid and a datum is how you pin it to the ground and how you define your origin of survey. So the geoid model is there, we have that, and we can celebrate the fact we've now got a very good model across New Zealand to a very high degree of accuracy. But until we start pinning our survey to the ground or physical marks on the ground, we don't yet define the datum. So that's when the network of benchmarks across the country become important to define our datum, because until we go and link to these, we are still just working with the geoid. And this is a very important point to note. I know people using wide area GPS and smart fixes and networks like that. happily load up their geoid and go about their business, and then come to me and claim that they're working on geoid 16 when they physically aren't linking their marks to points on the ground. And that is the difference to remember when I start talking about some of the examples of why it's important to note how we go about defining a datum and what the fundamental difference is when we move to New Zealand datum 2016. So that brings us on to my second point, and this is where we start talking about some actual examples of why NZVD 2016 is so good and why it is a game changer. So my first example point is about the fact that NZVD is more reliable and more repeatable. And I've drawn a basic example here to sort of describe a typical scenario of any job. Now I say any job, but I mean this could be, I've called it Site A, it could be a cell phone tower in the Coromandel, it could be a road intersection in South Auckland, it could be a cadastral job where you need to define a height restriction plane. Before you go out and do the job, as a surveyor, what would they do? They would look up the information around the job. Now, in the past, this would be a typical scenario where you search the information, you've got an old fifth order mark, maybe a trig on the site. If you look further afield, maybe out 5 or 10 kilometres, you may find a smattering of third order vertical marks in an urban sense that may be within a few kilometres. If you look further away, you may find an old first order benchmark run down a main road, and that may be 10, 15, 20 kilometres away. Now, when you go out and do the job, you know you've got to measure some heights, maybe a contour model, whatever the site brief is. Now you've got several choices, and to a large degree this may depend on how the job is scoped, how much the client's willing to pay, a number of factors. But when you get on site, one of the options you've got is to just adopt the nearest height. It's got a height, it's in terms of mean sea level, and that may be good enough. You may even decide to go out and check or go search for a couple of these third order marks. If it comes in within close enough, you can say that's reliable. Maybe they don't, maybe you find nothing else and you just give it an arbitrary height. You can quite happily do a survey on on that site using that mark. And this will happen in a number of scenarios. But perhaps you have to spend a bit more time doing this job, or maybe you've got a bit more budget. And so therefore you go out and you find some of these third order marks and you build up a bit of a network of measurements from your site onto these third order marks. And you get reasonably good agreement and you come up with your height for the site, and you establish your marks on site for future surveyors, contractors to come and construct whatever you're surveying. Another scenario might be that you decide you want to go over and above for whatever reason. Maybe you need more accurate heights, therefore you go further afield and you start linking into or looking for this old benchmark run down the main road and bring some baselines in from there. Now, any one of those scenarios have played out in projects I've worked on, and arguably are all as equally as valid as each other, depending on the scope. But they all derive a different result, and they are all dependent on which marks you find out there. And this is the problem we did face when relying on the old underlying benchmark and height network. So this is how it's been in New Zealand up to recently. And the problem is, this happens, two different parties come together, and I've seen scenarios where this is played out and somewhere in the middle, two jobs misalign in height. Neither party was arguably wrong, they've just come up with a different method of deriving heights for a site. So what's changed? NZVD16. So let's look at the scenario again under the context of New Zealand Vertical Datum 2016. Each of those marks no longer has a large degree of variability in the way their heights are defined, nor are they part of a decaying network in relation to the old tide gauges. What they are now based on is the New Zealand Geodatic 2000 system. So any mark which is part of the 2000 network can be the benchmark for your job. So all of a sudden, this mark, this mark, this mark, this mark, and potentially even these marks, if they were part of the GD 2000 network, are all equally valid ways of establishing the datum on that site, and both reliable and repeatable. So that if surveyor A used this mark, which most probably would, it was the nearest one, they check onto another mark to check that they are reliable marks and can define the height of that mark. Another surveyor may come along on a different day, perhaps this one was close to their office, whatever reason, decide to start here, check onto this mark. Within the context of that survey, the height datum will be the same. It's no longer up to the methodology deployed by the surveyor which marks they've chosen or how far afield they choose to go to define the height datum of that site. And for that reason, VD16 is a lot more reliable and a lot more repeatable. So my third point about VD 2016 as a datum is that it's easier to establish in any location at any scale. So for this, I'm going to build on the generic example from last time and give a specific. So this is the South Island of New Zealand. And the example I've used is Kaikoura earthquake. So Kaikoura earthquake zone covered much of the upper South Island east coast. And in my role, we were part of the team that came in as part of the first response looking at the railway tunnels on the network down the coast, of which there are a number of tunnels in varying states of repair. So this is a classic disaster recovery situation where we're coming in fresh on the ground shortly after the event and we need to start capturing survey information. So what NZVD16 did was make it far more reliable and accurate to establish heights across this site very quickly. So the geoid, New Zealand Geoid 2016, is, as we've heard, very resilient to disasters. The earthquake didn't change the geoid. Arguably it may change some of our GD 2000 marks on the ground slightly, but all we need to do is come in and find some of those marks, enough of them to link onto, apply the geoid, and we've got this datum across the whole site very quickly and very reliably, such that if we started here, went into one of our tunnels, went up the coast, we'd get a very similar result. So we didn't have to spend time up front re-establishing the height datum. We could very quickly use VD16, find enough marks of the GD 2000 network to link onto, and we very quickly and very reliably had our height datum and could get on with our work of surveying the tunnels. So not to leave the North Islanders out of this, my second example comes from around Auckland Way. And in my role I get involved in a lot of transport corridor jobs, and these are typically on a larger scale than your average job. And in the past a lot of time and effort goes into defining the height datum, because we have to take measurements over larger distances and take into account all the marks in the old underlying height datums that could be around that others may want to use or have used in the past or may want to link into. So a lot of time and effort goes into searching, looking for marks and connecting our control network to the underlying data. So let's look at that project example a bit closer in the area. And what we're talking about here is about 20 kilometres in South Auckland. Now, in the past, we would have spent a lot of time and effort going out and connecting our survey into the underlying height marks in terms of the old network and trying to find some sort of agreement with our height datum. Where NZVD 2016 is a game changer is that we can utilise the array of GD2000 marks over that project site to directly link our height datum. And what we found is the agreement across that network, both in the urban and the rural sense, was very reliable. In fact, we got as good agreement over the 20-kilometre area as we did between any given mark in the urban network. And we're talking in the order of plus or minus 20mm precision across that whole site. Now we could do that by simply applying the GEO 2016 to our measurements and linking our datum to the GD 2000 marks. And we have confidence that if anyone comes along in the future and comes off a different mark, they will get the same result.